Welcome to the Common Good Podcast, a conversation about the significance of place, eliminating economic isolation, and the structure of belonging. My name is Joey Taylor, and I'm the producer of the podcast. For this week's episode, I speak with Sam Pressler. Sam is a community builder, researcher, and writer focused on connecting people to the relationships and responsibilities that make life worth living. He was the founder and executive director of the Armed Services Arts Partnership, or ASAP, which was the nation's largest community arts organization serving veterans and their families. He also has a newsletter on Substack called Connective Tissue, and we talk about his work at ASAP, the privatization of community, and policy as a tool for creating the conditions for participation. Here's Sam.
One of the most formative experience of my life was when I somewhat accidentally started what became the organization, the Armed Services Arts Partnership, or ASAP. I was 20 years old. I was at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and the only thing that I knew is that I was not really passionate or energized by what I was working on in my government and finance majors. And so I had a chance over my winter break to take a step back and ask myself, what was I passionate about? What was I energized by before the world got in the way? And at that moment in time, it was humor and it was service. Like I wrote in my 5th grade yearbook that when I grew up, I want to be a comedy writer for SNL. And service was just a big part of my life and my family's upbringing. Both of my grandparents were in the military and then just kind of serving within the community. And so I frankly came back to campus the spring semester of my sophomore year with a solution looking for a problem, which you're not supposed to do that. But I think oftentimes some of the best things end up happening that way. And it was like, I want to do a stand-up comedy class for a specific group. I had never done stand-up comedy before, but I knew this is kind of the thing that I wanted to get into. And so down in Hampton Roads, Southeast Virginia, it's the most densely populated military community in the US. I also was doing research on veterans issues for one of my classes. And essentially through that research and through being in the community, I was like, oh, veterans and their families struggle to reconnect with communities after the military, struggle to at times to cope with their experiences. Like humor's how I connect with people, humor's how I cope. Let's do a stand-up comedy class for veterans. And I think unbeknownst to me, I was designing something in some ways for myself. Like I was a 20-year-old who had not yet completed college. A lot of people in the military are in their 20s and may or may not have completed college. And like, they're really interested in stand-up. And so we accidentally touched a nerve, started the stand-up comedy class, and it took off. And after that first class, people wanted to continue to engage in the arts with fellow veterans. And so over the course of my time in college, built that from this small little stand-up class to this community organization based out of William and Mary, serving veterans in all different art forms. And then over the course of my final year, translating that, fortunately through a fellowship from an organization called the Echoing Green Foundation, into a nonprofit that would kind of essentially work with local community arts organizations and the local military and veteran populations to provide veterans with sustained access to and then engagement in the community arts. I basically spent age 20 to 27 spending time building an organization that reconnects people with a sense of purpose in life, a sense of belonging in life, a translatable set of skills, and a potentially new identity to habit after leaving the military, when you oftentimes are left asking, like, who am I now? Where do I belong? What's next? It felt extremely countercultural. This was 2014 to 2020. This was a period of feeling seemingly peak division. And basically what I saw happen was a group of people who seemed to be different across every single line you can imagine, demographically speaking, who were coming together around a shared purpose to support each other unconditionally. And I came away from that feeling that it was nothing other than a sacred or magical experience when you get people together in that way. And so as I was able to hand that organization off to a new executive director and transition on, I was kind of left with these questions of like, this is the only thing I've done. I'm not a veteran and I'm not a comic, and I just played a role in building the largest military arts organization in the country. Like, why the heck did I do that? And a lot of the last few years of research and writing has been trying to uncover that for myself. And for me, where I landed, and it's a constant process of uncovering, is that like what it's really about is how do we connect or reconnect people to the commitments, the connections, the communities that give our lives meaning and make our lives worth living.
You talked about this realization that the work that you were doing with ASAP was sacred work. Can you think of a particular moment that really drives that home? Maybe a person or an instance when you had that realization?
When I was still a senior in college, one of the members of our writing group was a World War II veteran who served in the 4th Marine Division and was in the Battle of Iwo Jima. He was 92 when he got into the program, and through our writing class was writing about a lot of the experience he had 70 years prior, but hadn't really spent as much time kind of processing and writing through. And we ended up tipping off CNN about this guy, Joe Bruni, and what he was doing through the class. And so they came down to William & Mary, they filmed Joe as part of this writing group, and then they had Joe read one of the poems that he had written. It was about his best friend from childhood in Brooklyn, also named Joe, Joe Esposito, and it was called An Ode to Joe.
60 years given me beyond your 20, that precious gift denied you, that hellish day on the bloody sulfuric sands. Your right to survive, as great as mine, was denied by torn, jagged shell that claimed you and others, and spared me to retell. Your smile, as friendly as mine, your girl, as warm as mine, your future, as promising as mine. Yet I returned, and you were left behind. How do I respond to those soulful questions from your mom? Did my son suffer before he died? I said no, but I know I lied. A youthful prayer comes to mind. Lord, make me worthy. A universal prayer. Lord, make us worthy of his death, his suffering, and those of others. Although I presently live, part of my future death already remains with him.
Joe had passed. Joe was killed in the Battle of Iwo Jima, and the story was all about survivor's guilt of, I came home and you were left behind. So he reads that story on CNN. Then CNN puts it out Memorial Day weekend. A week later, I get a Facebook message from Joe Esposito's family saying that they hadn't connected with Joe Bruni in like decades and they would love to connect with him. And so we had a reading set up at a museum nearby. And I didn't tell Joe that they were coming because I wasn't sure if they were definitely going to come. They ended up arriving. And when they got there, they actually set out on a table. They set out a picture that Joe Bruni had painted of their uncle, Joe Esposito. And then they set out all of the letters that Joe Esposito and Joe Bruni had written home, and they like put it in a scrapbook. And so Joe Bruni walks up to the table. When he sees it, he goes, this is my picture. And then he goes, wait, these are really old letters. He goes, these are my letters. And he just breaks down crying, turns around, sees Joe Esposito's nephew, who looks just like Joe Esposito in the picture, and gives him a big hug as if this was the first time that he had seen his best friend in 70 years. I had that moment. I was like, oh, there will never be something more magical than this than happens again. But it was things like that of, you don't know what's going to happen when you bring people together, and particularly when you bring people together in these creative acts. But these are some of the downstream things that can happen that no survey would ever capture, or no way of measuring impact would ever capture. It's these deeply, deeply human experiences.
You did this work where you ask yourself questions like, what do I really care about? What's really interesting to me here? What's this work with ASAP sort of leading me into? And you have landed in a number of different things and arenas. But one of the things that you're doing is you're currently writing a report around some survey work that you've been a part of. Can you introduce a little bit of what that survey work is and maybe one or two key takeaways?
So I'm currently working with the Survey Center on American Life on a fairly large survey about essentially the landscape of social capital in the United States. And so when I say social capital, there's a million definitions of that, but what we're talking about is your opportunities to participate in community, your actual participation in community, the connections or relationships you have, things like that. And that emerged from research I've been doing over the last few years around how this dynamic that I've been calling the privatization of communities, how once accessible community outlets have declined and in their wake have been replaced by community outlets that have higher geographic, financial, and cultural barriers to entry, the downstream effect of which is people with college degrees, higher income people are continuing to participate and be involved in community. And we've seen a pretty significant drop off among people without college degrees, lower income. And that is not just happening in isolation, it's happening at every point of the life course. So you have less access to extracurricular activities in childhood, then it makes it harder potentially to get into a four-year college where you can build those relationships and the habits of participation. That makes it harder to have both the financial resources, the free time, post the adult transition to participate in community and frankly, either live in a place that has lots of community outlets or afford the community outlets that still exist. And so this survey in some ways is getting at that dynamic. And what we're seeing, it will be out in August. And so I can't speak to like exact specifics yet, but the dynamics we're seeing are very significant gaps by educational attainment, more so than in the most recent survey that this group had done. And because we have a larger sample size, ways in which class and race intersect. That where we're seeing a lot of these kind of class and racial dynamics intersect with one another and really speak to some of the shifts that have happened within community life. We asked a myriad of questions around access to both public and commercial third places, libraries, parks, but also coffee shops, barbershops, markets, gyms. We asked about actual habits of participation. We asked about membership in religion and unions and community groups. And so what we're seeing, I'm not making any causal story here with the data, I can't make that, but what you're seeing is very clearly people without college degrees tend to be living in places with fewer of what Hari Han calls civic opportunities to engage in civic or community life, partially because they have fewer opportunities. They participate less. There are other reasons why you participate less, but that's one of them. And then downstream from that, they're less likely to be members of groups. And then downstream from that, we see a very pronounced gap in friendships and relationships and social support. And so you can see all of that as sequential in some ways, where fewer opportunities, lower levels of participation, lower levels of membership, and lower levels of friendships and social support. And the dividing line around that is education and, in certain regards, the racial differences.
I hear you saying that the college degree phenomenon doesn't necessarily have a causal relationship, but it does have some associations around civic engagement. So what are some of the alternatives that you're thinking of that are implied within that finding? I know that you're really interested in things like alternative career pathways and even military service, but can you connect that interest to this conversation? How do those things relate?
This is a kind of Michael Sandel argument in The Tyranny of Merit, but we have to look at the role of the meritocratic version of four-year higher education and what it's done to our views of who deserves kind of these benefits. In the past, Sandel makes this point where we had an aristocracy who got to go to four-year schools, but coming with that aristocracy was the sense of you can't avoid the fact that you had the privilege to go to these schools. And so there is some like noblesse oblige. You can question how much that was true, but that is his argument. And today, because we're saying it's based on merit, we've now in some ways lessened the sense of obligation. It was like, oh, I deserve to get here. But what Raj Chetty and Richard Reeves and a lot of these other folks find is like, yeah, but you get these selected four-year schools largely if you're a child of like the top quintile of earners. And so it's gone from, and I'm not the first person to say this, but it's gone from a hereditary aristocracy to a hereditary meritocracy. And so we do need to figure out ways to break that. I think there are real critiques to be made of people who are college educated like myself, who are then saying, let's diminish the role of college. I don't make that case, but what I do think, and this is somewhat informed by my experience working with the military, is there is the potential of having having this kind of rite of passage experience at the adult transition that kind of cultivates virtues of service, virtues of participation, virtues of connection, both overall and across difference. And then that follows you later in life. But I also think having that at this point of adult transition, which really is shaping a lot of the behaviors that people are making earlier in life around their children. If you have something that people are aspiring to that is in addition to college, it can shape what happens earlier in life. So to me, it feels impossible to ignore the dynamics of the adult transition and how its effects are bidirectional in terms of affecting childhood and affecting everything that comes after in adulthood. And so I'm encouraged by the state level service year pushes that are happening in places like Maryland and happening in places like California and in Utah. I think they need to be much larger because right now there are a few hundred people and going up to a few thousand people that you'd really need to get this to the point where close to a majority of high school grads are participating. But I do think that is aligned with some of the things that I'm talking about. The other is there's a lot of pieces, but it's impossible to ignore how our neighborhoods shape these dynamics. Like our neighborhoods are still highly sorted by race. They're slightly less sorted by race, but they're way more sorted by socioeconomic status since the mid 1970s. And so what we're doing is basically hoarding social capital in the most educated and highest income places. And then we're depleting the more distressed places of the civic opportunities for participation and the social capital. And so the ability to leverage housing policy to build more mixed income communities, the ability to layer on kind of neighborhood programming and neighborhood engagement in more mixed income communities, that is also how you start to shift some of these dynamics as well.
It seems like there was a pretty dramatic shift, some moment when all of a sudden the conception of community moves from something that is local and accessible for everyone, that's local and accessible for everyone, regardless of socioeconomic status. And then this shift takes place.
I don't think it's one thing.
We're going to try to privatize
weary of reductive arguments here. I think it's a lot of things that are compounding upon one another.
Parks.
And so one, things become more expensive when the cost of land becomes more expensive. And to ignore the fact that particularly in urban areas, we have extraordinarily expensive real estate, like that then pushes you to have more premium prices in things that you're doing. It makes it much harder for nonprofit or more accessible organizations to be there. I think we have to then go back and look at the role of college. The shift from draft conscription-based military to an all-volunteer force did fundamentally change the nature of the adult transition, where prior, like World War II and slightly less so in Vietnam, the experience of military service was largely a cross-class, cross-geographic experience of the adult transition. And what we did is we created the GI Bill, and the GI Bill opened up college to the masses, which was great for World War II veterans. And then the meritocratic system of higher education came in following that. And then it largely became a system for the most well-off. As it got more competitive, we then changed the incentive structures in childhood, where like everyone is now competing to have extracurriculars. They're now competing to be on the best sports team to potentially get a scholarship. They're competing and trying to get tutors so they can increase their chances. So you see a lot of that happening. And then when you have the social sorting of college, what we see is your friendship networks and your relationship networks are largely tied to either your direct friends from college or the college-oriented social networks that you have. And then I don't think we can ignore the fact that the decline of religion is both a symptom and a cause. Religious communities are still the most accessible forms of community that are out there. And as they've declined, people have fewer of these outlets to be among other people and participate in community. And so there's a lot of other causes. I'm not even talking about technology or some of the economic forces, and I think they play a very large role, but it's a lot of these things happening all at once, and structure affects culture, affects policy, and they're always in a dance with each other. And so we've been in a dance towards individualism and isolation for the last 50, 60 years, partially in response to a fairly communitarian era from the early 1900s to the mid 1950s that at a certain point became suffocating, and then we saw this push to liberalism. So I do view us as we're at a moment of questioning, are we going to swing back a little bit from individualism towards a bit more in the collective sense?
I know that you're critical of some of the conversation currently around loneliness, social isolation, and social fragmentation. Why is it so important for you to locate the privatization of community as one of the primary causes of social isolation, as opposed to overly focusing on social isolation as a thing that needs to be addressed in and of itself?
Yeah, the challenge I have with a lot of these conversations is that they layer onto a surface level paradigm of individualizing the problem. So it's, oh, you don't have friends? Well, just go to a third place. Oh, like, you don't have friends? Have you tried reaching out to your friends? I mean, I'm being a little tongue in cheek here, but a lot of the current narrative is being driven by people who are either in policy or journalism, writing from places where they have access to all of these resources, and it becomes a matter of personal choice to do it. But if you do not live in a place that has any sort of civic opportunity, you're not going to be able to participate in it. If you have a parent who works two jobs or has unpredictable work and can't plan to be around to drive you to your extracurriculars or whatever, like, you're not going to be able to participate in that. These are very much structural issues that we're treating as individual ones. And no amount of doctor social prescribing you to go to a dance class is going to matter if there's not a dance class in your community. I'm being somewhat critical, but it's true. The public health establishment, their key thing around this is social prescribing. And I think if you live in Washington, D.C. or New York City or wherever, and you can get insurance to cover you to go to arts class or to go to a workout class or whatever, that's great. But if you don't live in one of those places, or you don't have the ability to control your schedule to go to those places, what are we talking about? So it's very easy to either speak to our class group or to individualize this, so we then take the responsibility off of ourselves to have any sort of civic movement building, any sort of cultural change, or any sort of structural change. And that's a lot of what's going on right now, is we're not having those conversations, or if we are, they're not as prominent within the policy discourse. And as a result, loneliness is a meme at this point. It's like, you're a man and you don't have friends, go play pickleball. That was a New York Times op-ed last summer. Like, it just feels very silly.
Before we continue with the conversation, we asked Sam for a poem that informs his work and his perspective on life. This poem is called When Death Comes by Mary Oliver. When death comes like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea. And I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy, and as singular. And each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending as all music does towards silence. And each body a lion of courage, and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. As we continue the conversation, Sam introduces a policy framework he just published.
I do think policy is almost always a lagging indicator or downstream from community-driven change and cultural change. It's the context for policy to even play a role here is somewhat a facet of potential opening around the fact that in our communities and in our broader culture, people are considering the role of solidarity, of collectivism, of some of these things that we just haven't been considering in a long time. So that really shapes the entire dynamics of coming forth with this on a foundational basis. I do believe there is a role of policy. I don't think it is the role, but I believe there is a role. And I think that comes from the idea that policy can play a role to create the conditions for us to have more of an ability to have civic opportunities in our life, more ability to participate in those civic opportunities, and more ability to form relationships. To say that there is no role of policy whatsoever is in some ways to ignore the way that policy has had a negative impact on these things in the past. And so within the framework, we really focus on those things that policy can very specifically do: boost civic opportunity, help create containers to experience life in community. It can help make those containers more participatory, either by boosting participation among targeted groups, or just promoting your freedom to participate. And it could play a role in promoting overall connection and connection across some line of difference. And so flowing from that, we identify various ways that policy can go from this really abstract, unsure of what to do thing to something very, very concrete. And so we start by focusing on foundational changes. How do we shift the way that we think about measurement? How do we rethink the way that we measure participation, connection within communities? We think about the role of personnel and what is the role of personnel within government in advancing participation, connection. And then we basically make a case that you can create what we call a connection lens, which is how do you apply a vision of strengthening connection, which is inclusive of civic opportunity participation, through everything you do in policy. And the analog to that is the environmental movement. The environmental movement took the environment, which was oftentimes seen as an input, and they made it the focus of policymaking. And we think that that can be something similar that can be done with policy around connection. So that's the first kind of way we look at it. Then we look at actual things that you can do. So we look at what we call community institutions, which involves housing and neighborhoods. It involves our civic infrastructure and associational life, and it involves care and education in these institutions that are on the border of communities. So then we look at the next piece, which is life transition. So what are the specific points in the life course, and transitionally speaking, that make it really hard to stay connected to people, but there's also real potential to flourish through those transitions. And so the focus of that is early childhood, both for newborns, but also new parents, the adult transition, which we've been talking about, of the period between high school and adulthood, community integration, the experience of being new to a place or returning to a place anew. And that could be in general, I just moved to a new place, but also specifically for three populations that have acute challenges with transition into new places, which are veterans, formerly incarcerated people, and immigrants and refugees, and viewing that as a shared experience, not disparate experiences. And then the final one is retirement, the older adult years. That's the life transitions component. And the final one is what we call enabling conditions, which is elements of policy that affect life in community, but are not necessarily about life in community. So that is work, thinking about how to promote more predictability and stability in work. The final one is local news and media, the local information ecosystems. And so that together kind of comprises the different chapters and sections. And then within each, we have policy opportunities for every level of government for each of those sections. And so the hope in all of this is we're taking something that people are like, yeah, we believe there's a role for policy, but I don't even know where to begin. And we're saying basically, here's 150 places to begin, and making it very tangible for people. And then beyond that, the elephant in the room, and frankly, where I didn't feel incredibly optimistic, is around tech and media policy. When Putnam looked back at his research in Bowling Alone, if he were to say, what is the one thing that led to civic decline in this country, he would say the introduction of television and streaming, social media, potentially AI chatbots. That to me all makes the threat of television seem fairly quaint. And while there is a recognition now of the negative effects of technology, it does feel like we are playing catch up there.
At the Common Good podcast, the primary agent of change is the local neighborhood, the local community. And as you're talking about policy, I totally agree with you that policy has a role. But I also know that from that perspective, there is a significant amount of unease and distrust when you're placing policy and the government as a central mover in this conversation around loneliness and community. How do you think about that crisis of trust between these two entities, the community and the role that government plays through policy? What's the way forward there?
Well, that gets at a key tension in this work for us. And I think one of the things we tried to approach this with, which is if we were to envision a spectrum from small d democracy, which is highly participatory, give people power, make sure that people are governing and decision makers, versus a more technocratic view, which is trust the data, fully evidence-based decision making, that we pretty clearly signal that we're more on the small d democratic side, that the antidote to alienation is participation. And if you want to have people feel like they have both more agency and trust in their community institutions, both government and civil society, the answer is not to ask why they don't trust you. It is to continually invite people in and allow them to be agents over their own destiny. And so a big principle across the report is emphasizing participation, and the focal point of government intervention in the report turned out to be very local and state level and not federal, right? Like there is a implicit devolution approach within this, in that local communities are oftentimes going to be best positioned to solve their own problems. And then, as I mentioned earlier, policy is going to be downstream in a lot of ways of culture and community. And so all of this only works if there is going to be an appetite within local communities to advance this policy forward. And so the orientation that I walk away from this with is that actually we need to acknowledge policy has a role. Policy can create the conditions for more people to be able to participate in community, which can then further energize potential civic renewal efforts. And in some ways, we can think of policy right now because so many things have happened from a policy perspective that have made it harder to participate in our shared collective lives. And so there is some work that needs to be undone. Ultimately, in this, where I land and continue to land, is that this is more driven from bottom-up participatory efforts than someone on high declaring that there is a crisis of connection and then kind of puppeteering their way into addressing that crisis. Because in some ways that involves using the tools that got us into this place to try to get us out of it. And that's not going to be what works.
The moment that struck me the most in this conversation, that's probably going to strike a lot of people who are listening, is the story about Joe Bruni at the beginning. You start to get into this conversation around privatization of community, the technocratic mode of policy, and it's just so easy to decenter yourself, your own agency, and to lose some hope at these macro trends that we hear talked about all the time around isolation and polarization and the demise of community. So I would love to hear you talk a bit about what's giving you hope in the work that you're doing. What are you seeing that makes you stop and say, oh no, that's not the whole story? Yeah, we do have social isolation, we do have fragmentation, but we also have what?
There are a lot of things that give me hope. I don't think we should just go for hope when things are feeling bad because we need to feel hopeful. But the first point I'll say is one that my friend Pete Davis, who's kind of touring this Join or Die documentary around the country right now, and Bob Putnam said to me, is like, during periods when things are at their lowest, that's when the seeds of renewal are being generated. And it does feel that we have reached a point in our economic systems, in our technological systems, in our experience of community, where it's not just people who are from lower socioeconomic status or lower educational backgrounds who are struggling. Just generally, people are asking really fundamental questions of what does it mean to live a good, flourishing life? And I think from that base across class, you see the potential of renewal. And I think we're at a point that is very different than the 1990s when there was this last communitarian wave and nothing really happened, where like things just still didn't feel as bad yet. We've now had 9/11 and 2 wars overseas. We've had the global financial crisis. We've had the shock that was like the presidential election in 2016. We've had opioid and deaths of despair epidemic, and we had a global pandemic. We've had every 4 years crisis that have like fundamentally shaken the foundations of our shared lives together. And that is going to force deeper questioning and deeper motivation. So I think that's very like still at this meta level, but like I do think we can't ignore that piece. The second is my formative years were with people who were coming together around some sort of shared goal to basically lift each other up and support each other unconditionally. And I did that when everything on TV was talking about how divisive we were. Everyone was talking about like how broken we were. And every single Saturday and Sunday, I would walk into a place and I would see people showing the exact opposite of what was happening. And all of that to me just reinforces, just as we have the potential to isolate or to become isolated and to kind of turn into ourselves, we also have the potential to kind of look outward, to lift our brothers and sisters up, and to fulfill the potential of community, which is individual and collective flourishing. And so that is the cause for hope. Like, we're not different, and we still have that within us.
So the plan here is for you to join us to host some conversations with some folks who you respect and you've been learning from. Some of these people that we'll be talking to are people that have informed the work that you're doing on the Connective Tissue Substack. I would love to hear you talk about your intention for the conversations that we'll be having, and if there's a thread that unites all of the people we'll be speaking with.
I'd say, particularly in these conversations around these really kind of fudgy subjects like community and connection and civic life, because they're in some ways so impossible to define, and that's okay, it ends up getting really to the surface level. And the people that I've been talking to with Connective Tissue, the newsletter, and who I hope to speak with on this podcast are just people who in my day-to-day have challenged and forced me to deepen my engagement with these issues, with the nature of what it means to be in community with others, what it means to care in community, but also like what it means to how we think about these issues in a broader economic, cultural, social context. And those are the people that I've found myself gravitating towards. And so in some ways, I'm excited to just bring them in here because I enjoy it every time.
Thanks for listening. Check the show notes for information about Sam, ASAP, Connective Tissue, and his recent published policy framework. This episode was produced by me, Joey Taylor, and the music is from Jeff Gorman.